Hi, everybody. I'm Josh Welsh, president of Film Independent. We're about to get to a conversation with the filmmakers of the Night House. But before we do, I just want to do a couple of thank yous. Thank you to our sponsors of Film Independent Presents, the HFPA and Vision Media, and also huge thanks to Fox Searchlight for making today's screening possible. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming the director, David Bruckner, and actor Rebecca Hall from the Night House.
My husband took the boat out on the lake. He took a handgun that I didn't even know that we owned, and
you were right.
You were right.
There's nothing.
There is nothing. You're safe now. Safe from what?
David, to kick things off, would you just talk a bit about how the script came to you and how you got involved? What drew you to it?
Yeah, well, I've known writers Ben Collins and Luke Petrowski for quite some time. We'd worked on another project together that I was a small part of, and they're pals of mine. And this was a script that they had first mentioned and brought up way back in 2014, and then another director got a hold of it for a little while. So I didn't actually see it until 2017. And I just finished a movie, and Ben Collins called me and was like, "You really got to read this. You really got to read it." And sat down and read it, and thought it was, a heck of a downward spiral. And just fell in love with it. And so I immediately knew that it was a movie that I had to be a part of, and found myself advocating it to everyone I could talk to. And luckily, I mentioned it to the right people. And David Goyer and Keith Levine came on board, and we set off to build a team.
Did the script change substantially once you got involved? Was there a development process where you sort of wanted to shape it in a somewhat different direction, or was it as written?
It was always the essence of what Ben and Luke had set out to do. So, I mean, there are scenes in the movie that are, letter to the letter, exactly as they were in that first draft. But there's a mystery that has to be engineered. There were questions throughout about how you would sort of work the suspense, and then there were mythology questions and stuff. So I'd say we worked on it for about a year, maybe about 8 months before I think, Rebecca, you first saw it. And you kind of work on it, all the way until you're filming, and then quite a bit once you're done filming. But it was always a bit confounding in a way that I really loved, and contradictory in ways that I thought was super exciting. So our development process was really about clarifying things, but trying to preserve, the ambiguities that we loved, like not answering too many questions, hopefully.
I mean, the thing I love most about the film is it works. It's scary as hell. It's just, right. I mean, it works just to terrify you, to terrify me, but it's also this beautiful study of grief. And then it also works as a mystery of, Rebecca, your character uncovering, like, what the hell was my husband up to? And it's kind of, it's very ambitious in weaving those different elements together. Was that sort of all in there from the beginning, the study of grief as well as the more genre elements?
Yeah, I think that was in the DNA from the beginning, was that this was, I think one thing that, you hang out with Ben and Luke for a while, and they're very aware of horror tropes as means of communication, or, artistic choices. And that, those tropes can be, utilized to describe emotions, pictures the human experience, the human mind. We actively kind of think of them in that way. So I think that was all the spirit of it very much from the beginning. I think a lot of the work is just tinkering and engineering and asking questions. And what if we go left here instead of right, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca, I'm curious, what drew you to the project when you first read it? Why did you want to get involved?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, but really the predominant thing was that I was very compelled by the Beth. I mean, she's kind of an unusual horror heroine. I mean, it always struck me that we sort of know fundamentally now that watching a woman being terrorized in a house alone is scary. We know this from many movies and many stories and many ideas. But this posed a question, or maybe not a question, it sort of set up something a little bit further than that, in that, is it arguably scarier to watch a woman alone being terrorized, who is welcoming the terror, who wants the terror, and who is running towards it at all times? And is it a sort of moment in her life when she sort of has nothing to lose in that sense? So she's reckless and emotionally unstable. And I think that is actually much scarier than watching, and I thought that was kind of unusual and a little bit of an inversion on the trope that we're used to, whilst playing with it at the same time. And the other thing that, I think a lot of great horror movies, or genre movies for that matter, work when there's sort of two parallel interpretations going on. And it occurred to me with this one that there are two sort of basic interpretations going on, but within those two interpretations, they're also multi-layered. And for me, the sort of root of it, and the thing that I found most fascinating, was dealing with the idea of someone who is dealing with grief, specifically who is a suicide survivor, someone who is 3 days prior has lost their loved one to suicide and is left with this feeling of, how did I not know that person well enough to know that he was going to do that? Mm-hmm. And then to take that idea and then push it to an extreme of like, well, if I didn't know he was capable of doing that, what else did I not know he was capable? What's the most extreme version of not knowing someone that I can think of that may or may not be true, that can help me process that? So in a way, the whole thing becomes, for me anyway, that it's a sort of psychological with an extent, and also kind of honest. Yeah.
Yeah, I love what you were saying earlier about how she's sort of reckless and running towards the danger. And I found Beth very, the way you play her, she's very unsentimental, or there's something very, people, especially in the scenes with her friends and her colleagues, like everyone's sort of walking on eggshells, and she's just very blunt and direct. And there's a kind of toughness. I mean, she's vulnerable and obviously in danger, but there's a kind of toughness and strength to her that I thought was really interesting.
Well, that was very much there on the page, and it felt, I mean, that's the thing that really struck a chord with me. It's like, I don't think 3 days after this event happening, or however long it is, 4 days or whatever, who knows that she would have even been able to cry yet. It feels like the film is a process of getting her to the point of being able to cry about it. And, there are all these defenses up to deal with it instead that are incredibly brittle and sort of funny. And, and that I think makes her very kind of, I don't know, it makes her weirdly likable. It's like, it should be the opposite, but I found it such a, the anger response is sort of the honest response in a way. So
yeah. So for so much of the film, you're alone on screen. I mean, there are scenes with other people. And of course, there are a lot of scenes where you're alone with the presence in the house, or you're alone with your grief. But essentially, the camera is on your face, and it's so much of this film is just right there. It's in your eyes and your expression. And I'm just curious how you approach that, like how you, as an actor, how do you modulate your performance over the course of a film in terms of what you're giving and how you build that?
The things that I, look, I'm kind of a sucker for accepting roles that I know are going to be tough. I don't know why. And it's not that I gravitate towards dark material. It's just often that's the place where you find that sort of stuff that's going to be hard to do, that will keep my interest and in that respect. But the things that I thought were going to be hard about this one were hard. Being on your own a lot is hard, purely from a stamina perspective. You forget how much energy you derive from other actors. And to just try and generate that energy by yourself is sort of like mentally and physically exhausting. But there was also, but the flip side of that was that it was incredibly liberating on some level. and not because I didn't have another actor to act with, I'm not saying that. I think just more because the extremity of the stuff that was required of me, and the bandwidth and the freedom that David gave me to just sort of experience things instinctively was liberating. I mean, we didn't have lengthy, I mean, there was stuff that was, organized with stunt directors and all that sort of thing, but there was also an element to the physical stuff, certainly, that was basically improvised from a sort of instinctive point, and I naively assumed there would be lots of choreographers and this and that and all the rest of it, but actually it boiled down to, okay, and now we do the scene where you make out with a ghost, and let's see what you do. And you can't, but there is, and it's so preposterous and so silly, and you have to be so willing to make such a fool of yourself that every trace of self-consciousness disappeared. And I just thought, wow, this is great. I'm just flinging myself around a room and I have no idea what I'm going to do when they call action. And so when you ask me, how did I prepare for it? I don't know. I think getting to the point where I was willing to just see what happened when he called action was how I prepared for it, because it didn't feel to me that there was any other way to do it.
Just to add to that, I mean, what Beth's going through is almost impossible to wrap your head around. I mean, not knowing that your husband would go and do this, to have this out of the blue happen, to see the rug pulled out from under her to such an extreme degree. I mean, I know that I struggled quite often with the script of just going, it's difficult for me to relate to this in a way that I can pull from directly. I don't know where Beth is in this moment. And I think, for me, part of the draw of Beth is that she gets ahead of the audience. And in a lot of ways, we're kind of catching up with her. And so the more we care about her, which happens organically throughout the film, the better. But sometimes what she's dealing with is at a reach for us. And so you're kind of watching somebody that you care about teeter on the edge of the cliff. And, for a lot of these scenes, we would go into it. I think, like you're saying, Rebecca, I kind of was on the limb of just going, we're going to try something and we're going to see what it looks like. And, I was really, when we first did the ghost interaction in the bathroom, I didn't know how some of that was going to come across. And what struck me was how sad it was how sympathetic I felt to the moment. And to kind of feel that coming through and feel that coming through your performance at a time where, as a filmmaker, I can easily become very preoccupied with gags and whether or not some of the stuff looks good, but to feel it land in that way, I mean, it just, it had to be a very, very intuitive process, and obviously took a ton of trust from Rebecca and fearlessness to just walk into it and give this stuff a shot.
Yeah, but I think that's true, and you were very trustworthy, so thank you for that. But there was also, I've already used the word liberating, so, but there is some truth to that, because at a certain point it felt like doing a sort of contemporary dance, like based on emotions, which is something that you never get to do as an actor. And but it's weirdly pure, actually, to just sort of try and show something with your body. So that I was really grateful for those moments.
It's an incredible scene, and I felt like I was watching, like, on the one hand, I felt like I was watching this beautiful dance performance that I don't know. I mean, the way you were moving in the space, and it was beautiful. And then it was also, of course, terrifying, because you don't know what's going to happen. I mean, especially, where you end up in the same shape as the figurine. It's like truly horrifying where it goes. But and then also just, I mean, David, I wanted to ask you, like, how did you, just on a technical level, how did you do that? Like, when you see the imprint of his body on her fingertips and on her skin, that was, visually beautiful. It was like simple, but really cool.
There were a lot of conversations about prosthetic arms, how did they do it in this movie or that movie? And then there were lengthy CGI conversations, and where we landed was air guns. We built a couple air gun fingers, and we just did it for real there in the location. But it was that's always one of those kind of challenging moments in movies, because it's impossible to communicate all the details of what looks right. So it just takes a lot of patience on Rebecca's part, and SFX, and everybody who's kind of crammed into a moment just
Right.
trying to drag 4 air hoses across a part of someone's body and just hope it looks right. And you just kind of roll it till you get it right. And but we shot a lot of that stuff. Yeah, there were a few gags there that didn't quite work too. So you know, a lot of some clear plastic stuff that you could interact with. Couple paint outs. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. David, the film is visually stunning. I mean, I thought, you know, there's a lot of scenes that are very dark, but the film is not murky or too shadowy. It's like there's a crispness, and I mean, just it's gorgeous. The cinematography, the color palette, the house, everything is really beautiful. And I just wondered if you could talk a bit about how you approach the film visually and how you work with your cinematographer on this, and what drew you to Elijah to be the DP.
Yeah, I'd seen Columbus, and he just had a softness, a way of throwing light around the room that just felt very natural. Also just there was like an intimacy to it that I think is always really interesting to get into horror. Like some of the conversations we had was just, we would talk about how it is at times, it's really nice if you can find yourself in a film that it would feel inappropriate for things to turn into a horror film, to go in the direction that they do. Maybe because there's something beautiful about the images or something mature about the images in a way that you almost can't imagine the film's going to go where it's going to go. And we also spent a lot of time talking about just how you manage darks in a world in darkness, and how we could subtly train the audience to the geography in the house, the way open spaces work, so they would become familiar with all of these environments before things start to go wrong. But it's really a collaboration between Elijah and Catherine Eder, our production designer, to both try to visualize this as fast as we could. It was a short prep, and you know, you make a few decisions and you run in and you go for it. But Elijah has in particular a really amazing grasp on light exposure, and I think we felt it in every frame. And
architecture. I mean, obviously in Columbus, but here I felt like the way the house is filmed. I mean, to your point, that the daytime scenes, the house is so open and sunny, it doesn't feel like you're in a horror film. And every night, it's just like there's some really simple scenes that were so chilling, where you'll see a shape behind Beth, like some arrangement of fabric or wall will look like a person. It's the most simple thing, but completely effective in creating that sense of terror. And I don't know, I just loved how the house changed, from being this warm, sunny, welcoming place to the place of her darkest terror.
Yeah, we most of the house is a real house that we shot on a lake, but then we also built versions of the rooms where the dimensions of the house had changed. So once you got comfortable with one environment, then you may find yourself in a slightly different version of that same environment. And so we were kind of playing with, could you feel it but not know it? I'm still not quite certain if the audience does notice all of those things. Perhaps they don't need to. And then the shadow gags, we call them negative spaceman gags, were really about finding the absence of Owen in the architecture of the house. And that was based on a few optical illusions that we were inspired by. And we brought in another filmmaker, Pat Horvath, who I had worked with on an anthology film, Southbound. And he's a visual artist and a all-around thinker of all things cinematic and illusions in general. And he would kind of go into these environments and sort of try and find a way to line up like the perfect negative spaceman opportunity. And so some of those were builds, some of those were little adjustments that we made on set, but they were all real. So you could stand on set and see nothing, and if you walked to the right point, you would see the world kind of line up into the shape of a man. And it's always great if you can actually experience it on set. You're not, kind of witnessing a green screen. I find people rally around it. It gives me a better idea of what's going on. But those were fun and particularly challenging.
I also thought the sound design on the film was beautiful and very, like, it was not I don't know how to describe my experience of it, but like it was not, it was simple and did not feel at all heavy-handed, but definitely worked to create, like subtle sounds would create major effects for me as a viewer. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about your approach to sound design and how you work with the composer and in editing, creating that.
Well, the composer Ben Lovett, this is was our fourth movie together. An old friend of mine I went to college with, so him and I have been working on various projects or projects of other friends for years, and just have a dialogue. And Night House, and I think even Rebecca and I, our early conversations was something that, for me, the kind of confounding nature of it was a movie that I felt like I was finding the whole time. Sometimes there's a project where you're like, I know how it sounds, I know how it feels, I know how it's going to unravel. But with this one, it was full of all these different contradictory ideas and feelings, and a lot of that manifests in the soundscape. So even in post, when we had a first cut and we're looking at it, we're still kind of scratching our heads, going, "What is this?" And so Ben is a consultant for me as well as a composer, and has a narrative take on what's going on, and becomes a very, very involved collaborator at a certain point. So the landscape of how much music and when to use it and how not to is also very much zeroing in on what part of Beth's experience we're trying to describe. And what we're taking from the performance in a moment where we don't want to double up on the performance, where you don't need us at all. And and our sound designer, Rich Schnupp, who was our designer and our mixer, has an incredible ear. And this is my first time working with him. And it was just astonishing to see him work and come in. And we had ideas about the woodwork and the lake and feeling the atmosphere of the film all around. But whether those things really land or have an effect oftentimes just comes down to, whether that designer has a grip on it and can really love on it the right way. And, he turns a dial, slightly to the right, and suddenly something has an effect or emerges in a way you didn't know that it would before. So Rick's just got an amazing ear. I'm still discovering things that he's done in the film.
I wanted to talk about Vondi Curtis Hall. His character I thought was so interesting. He's not in a lot of scenes, but and I can't put my finger on it, but I mean, Rebecca, like your scenes with him, there was such an interesting relationship between the two of them. And like, he seems like he's kind of the warm, friendly neighbor, but then he knows a lot more, right? He's got a level of awareness of some dark stuff, and it's a more complicated relationship. I'm curious it's a question for either or both of you, just sort of what his role is in there, and how you, Rebecca, how you approach those scenes.
I suppose I mostly approached those scenes with relief, because it was just nice to have those scenes with other people now and then. But and also, he's really great, and his face is so recognizable from such a million different things, and I think he brings with him a certain amount of warmth. And there's also an inversion of that in the movie that I think is interesting. So there was, it was just a sort of, it was an interesting dance, those scenes with him, because he provided this sort of respite, and then suddenly this sort of, was I wrong to trust this person feeling at the same time, which I think was important for where Beth was at, but also useful for the movie.
Yeah, we talked a lot about both Vondi's role and Sarah Goldberg's. That there's also a movie about help, about people that are trying and failing to help Beth and can't get through to her, and in many points they're sort of giving her bad medicine, and don't really understand where she's coming from, and are sort of at risk of feeling Beth's frankness from one moment to another. They could get a bit bruised if they say the wrong thing. But I think the difference with him is that he had seen something, and he had been through something, and he did have something to offer, but couldn't seem to get through to her. And of course, the peril of doing that is that you could get there too late. And so we talked about that effect a lot, and about the difficulty of just getting across to someone.
Was I have one last question, which again, I could be for both of you, but it is in the film, there's this idea, I mean, I guess it relates to the theme of grief, but it's this idea that depression can be catching, you know, that your husband caught the depression is like a darkness that you had that went into him and led him to kill himself. And now it's coming back for you. And it's just like that whole idea is really, it's such an interesting idea. And it feels like it's kind of the film explores it, you know, plays with that idea throughout. And I'm just curious how you guys think of that in the film. Was that something that you discussed, or it was just there in the script?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, one of the really interesting things is that you're learning about this relationship after the fact between Beth and Owen. And then I always kind of imagined that they had really next level communication as a couple, you know, just the idea that they had differing ideas about the afterlife that was a standing conversation between them, and that they knew that about one another. And that they had these really kind of profound disagreements, and that there was an awareness that Beth's depression could affect him in some ways. And that if you look back on the story, he hid his own. I think the suggestion is to protect her in some way or another, and then maybe put himself at peril from doing that, because he wasn't open to her on some level. And so a lot of layers to their communication, their miscommunication, that I think really, really added to it. It all kind of sits in the background of the story. It's sort of there to pick apart and find if you want to look a little bit deeper. But yeah, from the beginning, the idea that there's an anxiety about the responsibility that we have for one another, the knowledge or the recognition that we do have an effect on one another. And, you know, to some degree for me, I feel like that's part of the pain that Beth is experiencing throughout the film, and that there is a guilt component where that's concerned as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, it feels like it's weaving around in there with all these other vibes.
Mm. No, exactly. That's what I was going to say, the guilt element, very much so.
Yeah, it really comes through. Well, Rebecca and David, thank you both so much for being here. The film comes out theatrically in the US on August 20th from Searchlight Pictures. So everyone go see it, tell your friends, get back in theaters. And thank you again for being here. I love talking to you.